The year is 1959. The location is a high-security conference room deep within the Kremlin walls, Moscow. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the stale smell of nervous sweat. General Anatoly Bleganravov, the head of the Soviet delegation to the Committee on Space Research, sits at the head of a heavy oak table. He is a man who is used to holding the winning hand. For 2 years, the Soviet Union has dominated the headlines. They put the first satellite, Sputnik, into orbit. They put the first living creature, Laika, into the stars. And now they have launched Lunic, a series of probes destined to touch the face of the moon. To the world, Lunic is a symbol of peaceful scientific triumph. But in this room, the men know the truth. Lunic is not just a scientific instrument. It is the upper stage of a mighty intercontinental ballistic missile. It is the terrifying proof that the Soviet Union can deliver a nuclear warhead to any city in the United States. It is the ultimate bluff, and it is working. The Americans are terrified. The West is shaking. But today, the general is not smiling. He is staring at a document that has just been slid across the polished wood by a pale-faced KGB colonel. It is a transcript from a closed-door briefing in Washington, D.C., intercepted by Soviet intelligence only hours ago. The general picks up the paper. His eyes scan the Cyrillic type. The Americans are discussing the Lunic. That is to be expected. They are obsessed with it. But as the general reads further, his blood runs cold. The American engineers are not speculating. They are not guessing. They are quoting numbers. They are quoting the exact diameter of the Lunic's mounting bolts. They are discussing the specific alloy composition of the engine nozzle. They are laughing about the crude, heavy wiring harnesses hidden inside the casing wiring that no Western eye has ever seen. The general slams the paper down. The sound echoes like a gunshot in the silent room. "This is impossible," he whispers. He looks up at the KGB colonel. "Where did they get this? Who told them?" The colonel shakes his head, his face a mask of confusion. "We do not know, Comrade General. The Lunic has never been captured. It has never been lost. It has been under 24-hour guard by our most loyal men since it left the factory. No American has ever been within 10 feet of the internal mechanism." The general stands up and walks to the window, looking out at the grey Moscow skyline. The impossible reality is sinking in. The Americans know the secrets of their greatest weapon. They know its weight, its thrust, its limitations. The bluff is dissolving. If they know the Lunic, they know the missile. And if they know the missile, they know that the Soviet Union is not as invincible as it claims. This is not just a leak. It is a ghost story. The probe was never missing. The seals were never broken. The guards never reported a single incident. And yet, the data is there, sitting on a desk in the Pentagon. It is as if the Americans walked through walls, as if they turned invisible, as if they reached into the heart of the Soviet security apparatus and plucked the secrets out of the air. The general turns back to the room, fear replacing the anger in his eyes. "Find out how they did it," he orders. "Tear the security protocols apart. Interrogate everyone. If we have a traitor, I want his head. If we have a flaw, I want it found. Because if they can see inside the Lunic, they can see inside everything." If you want to understand the hidden history of the Cold War and the secrets that shaped our world, make sure you subscribe to Cold War Impact right now. The stakes could not be higher. To understand why this moment in the Kremlin was so terrifying, we must understand what the Lunic actually represented. In the late 1950s, the balance of power was measured in thrust and tonnage. The United States was struggling with rockets that exploded on the launch pad, affectionately and tragically dubbed Kaputniks by the press. Their rockets were sleek, complicated, and fragile. The Soviets, by contrast, built brute force machines. The R-7 Semyorka, the rocket that carried the Lunic, was a monster. It was huge, heavy, and undeniably powerful. When the Soviets sent the Lunic probe on a global tour to showcase their industrial might, it was a victory lap. They took the actual industrial models stripped of their active engines but identical in airframe and dimensions and paraded them through the capitals of the world. It was a display of supreme confidence. The Soviet leadership believed their security was impenetrable. They believed that by keeping the probe under constant visual surveillance, by surrounding it with armed guards, and by controlling every second of its transport, they could dazzle the world without giving away a single secret. They were wrong. The mystery that began in that Kremlin conference room would trigger one of the most frantic and paranoid investigations in the history of the KGB. It was a puzzle that defied the laws of physics and espionage as they understood them. Usually, when secrets are stolen, there is a trail. A safe is blown open, a door is forced, a guard is bribed or knocked unconscious. A scientist defects to the West with a briefcase full of blueprints. But here, there was nothing. The Lunic exhibitions had taken place in Paris, in Mexico City, in Oslo. In every city, the routine was the same. The probe arrived in a massive crate. It was transported on a Soviet truck, driven by Soviet drivers, flanked by Soviet guards. It was set up in the exhibition hall, cordoned off by velvet ropes and armed men. At night, the hall was locked and patrolled. When the exhibition moved, the process was reversed. The KGB had files on every minute of the tour. They had logs of every person who approached the crate. They had the names of every local worker who helped lift the heavy timber. The colonel back in Moscow reviewed the files until his eyes burned. He looked for the gap, the mistake, the moment of weakness. He found nothing. According to the records, the Lunic had remained in absolute custody. There was no window of time, not even 10 minutes, where it was unaccounted for. To disassemble a probe of that complexity, to photograph the internals, to measure the engine geometry, to analyze the wiring, that would take a team of experts hours. It would require heavy tools, bright lights, and a workshop. It could not be done in a moving truck. It could not be done in a crowded exhibition hall. It certainly could not be done while the Soviet guards were standing right there. And yet, the Americans knew. The fear began to spread through the Soviet hierarchy like a virus. It wasn't just about the technology anymore, it was about the uncertainty. If the Americans could do this, what else could they do? Were there microphones in the Politburo? Were there cameras in the missile silos? This phantom capability threatened the foundation of the Soviet strategic deterrent. The Soviet Union relied on the perception of overwhelming power. They relied on the West believing that the Soviet missiles were endless and unstoppable. But if the Americans had looked inside the Lunic, they would see the crude reality. They would see that the guidance systems were heavy and outdated. They would see that the payload capacity was being exaggerated. They would see the Soviet Union was a giant with clay feet. The mystery deepened as the investigation expanded. The KGB began to look for phantoms. They analyzed radar logs for unauthorized aircraft near the transport routes. They interrogated their own guards, accusing them of sleeping on duty, of taking bribes, of being drunk. Men who had served loyalty for years were dragged into basements and questioned under bright lights. Did you leave the truck? No. Did you stop for food? Only for 20 minutes. We ate by the wheels. Did anyone approach the crate? No one. The answers were maddeningly consistent. The impossible event remained impossible. The Soviet leadership was left with a terrifying conclusion. They were fighting an enemy they could not see, who could walk through locked doors and manipulate reality. The Lunic mystery became a bogeyman. It was whispered about in the corridors of the Lubyanka. It became a symbol of a new kind of warfare, a warfare where steel and guards and guns were useless against an enemy who fought with silence and shadows. But while the Soviets chased ghosts and tore their own ranks apart looking for a traitor who didn't exist, they were missing the truth. The answer wasn't in a high-tech gadget or a magical device. It wasn't a traitor. It wasn't an invisible plane. The answer was far more audacious and far more insulting to the Soviet pride. It involved a dusty road, a bit of lumber, a set of standard wrenches, and the one thing the Soviets never accounted for, the simple human need for a good dinner. The panic within the Kremlin did not stay contained in the conference room. It bled outward, seeping into the stone corridors of the KGB headquarters at Dzerzhinsky Square. The order from General Blagoravov was absolute. Find the leak, close it, silence it. For the Soviet intelligence apparatus, the existence of the American data was an existential nightmare. It wasn't just that the Americans knew, it was what they knew. The Americans had the serial numbers of the components. They had the precise calibration data of the guidance gyroscopes. They had the electrical resistance values of the internal circuitry. This level of detail effectively ruled out traditional espionage. A spy looking at a blueprint could steal a design, but they couldn't steal the specific quirks of a single manufactured unit. A defector could describe a system, but they couldn't memorize thousands of random digits from a component manifest. The conclusion was terrifyingly simple. The Americans had physically handled the Lunic. They had touched it. They had opened it. But how? Colonel Yuri Korolev, a veteran of counterintelligence, was tasked with the impossible investigation. He began by reconstructing the timeline of the Lunic's journey, minute by minute, mile by mile. The probe had been the star of the exhibition of the achievements of the national economy. It was a propaganda weapon, touring the globe to prove Soviet superiority. Korolev laid out the map on his desk. The red line traced the probe's path. Moscow to Paris, Paris to Oslo, Oslo to Mexico City to Moscow. He started with the physical security. The protocols were ironclad. The crate containing the Lunic was a fortress of timber and steel. It was massive, 20 feet long, 11 feet wide. It was not something you could slip into a pocket. It required a crane to move. Furthermore, the crate was sealed with diplomatic wax stamps. If the crate had been opened, the seals would be broken. The KGB agents who accompanied the tour swore that the seals were checked every morning and every evening. They were intact. Korolev brought in the guards. These were not conscripts. They were GRU Spetsnaz and elite KGB officers, men chosen for their unshakable loyalty. They sat in the interrogation chairs, their faces pale under the harsh lights. "Tell me about the transport in Paris," Korolev demanded. "We drove the truck ourselves," the captain of the guard replied, his voice trembling slightly. "We never stopped. The local police escorted us, but they never got close. We unloaded the crate directly into the exhibition hall. We slept in shifts next to it." "And the hotel?" "We didn't stay in hotels. We stayed with the probe." Korolev moved down the list. Oslo. Same story. The probe was never left alone. The crate was never out of sight. Then, Mexico City. This was the leg of the journey that worried Korolev the most. It was the chaotic heart of the tour. The crowds were immense. The logistics were messy. The probe had to be moved from the rail yard to the exhibition grounds. He pulled the file on the Mexico City transfer. "You used a local trucking company," Korolev accused the logistics officer. "Why?" "We had no choice, Comrade Colonel," the officer pleaded. "Our own transport trucks were delayed at the port in Veracruz. The exhibition was opening in 24 hours. The ambassador ordered us to hire local heavy haulers. But we took precautions. We had a Soviet escort car following the truck. We had a Soviet man in the cab with the driver." Korolev leaned in. "Who was in the cab?" "Agent Volkov." "Bring him in." Volkov was a hard man, a true believer. He sat stiffly in the chair. "I sat in the passenger seat," Volkov stated flatly. "The driver was a local. He spoke no Russian. I spoke no Spanish. We drove from the train station to the exhibition. It was late. The traffic was bad." "Did the truck stop?" "No." "Did the driver make any calls?" "No." "Did you lose sight of the convoy?" "The escort car was behind us the whole time. I checked the mirror every 30 seconds. Korolev slammed his fist on the table. "Then how did they do it, Volkov? Did they beam themselves inside the crate? Did they freeze time?" The interrogation went on for days. They analyzed the route maps. They checked the weather reports. Was there fog? Was there a blackout? Nothing. The timeline was seamless. The truck left the station at 5 p.m. It arrived at the exhibition at 6 p.m., 1 hour. 1 hour was barely enough time to drive the route in heavy traffic. It was certainly not enough time to hijack a truck, drive it to a secret lab, open a 20-foot crate, disassemble a multi-ton spacecraft, photograph it, reassemble it, and get it back on the road without the man in the passenger seat noticing. The investigation hit a dead end. The physical evidence said the probe was never touched. The intelligence evidence said the probe was fully compromised. The Soviet analysts began to turn on each other. Paranoia blossomed like a fungus in the dark. If the physical access was impossible, then the leak must be coming from the top. They began to suspect the scientists. Perhaps the chief designer himself was a traitor? Perhaps the blueprints had been microfilmed and smuggled out in a hollow tooth? But that theory didn't hold water either. The Americans had data on the imperfections of the specific unit, the scratches on the metal, the wear on the bolts. A blueprint doesn't show wear and tear. The KGB began to build a legend around this failure. They started to whisper about American super technology. Reports began to circulate in the Kremlin suggesting that the CIA possessed X-ray cameras capable of photographing through timber and lead. Others suggested the Americans had developed miniature listening devices that could analyze the vibrations of the probe during transport to map its internal structure. It sounds ridiculous now, looking back from the 21st century. But in the late 1950s, technology was moving so fast that magic and science were hard to distinguish. If the Soviets could put a dog in space, why couldn't the Americans have an X-ray camera that saw through wood? The fear of this ghost technology paralyzed Soviet innovation. They began to line their shipping crates with lead sheets, making them heavier and harder to transport. They started welding the bolts shut, making maintenance a nightmare for their own crews. They spent millions of rubles trying to block a technology that didn't exist. But while the KGB was chasing science fiction villains, they missed the one detail that was sitting right in front of them in the Mexico City logs. It was a detail so mundane, so bureaucratic, that every single investigator's eye slid right over it. It was about the truck. In the file, buried under piles of stamped forms and customs declarations, was a note about the transfer at the rail yard. The Lunic crate was the last item to be loaded onto the truck. The scheduled departure was 5 p.m., but the logs from the exhibition hall showed the truck arriving not at 6 p.m., but the following morning. Korolev had missed it. Or rather, he hadn't missed it. He had accepted the explanation provided by the logistics team without question. The explanation was simple. The truck was held overnight at the rail yard due to a scheduling error with the crane. It was under guard in the depot. Under guard in the depot. Those 5 words were the shield that hid the truth. Korolev assumed under guard meant Soviet guard. He assumed the depot was a secure, well-lit facility. He assumed the chain of custody was unbroken. He assumed wrong. The Soviets were looking for a high-tech heist. They were looking for James Bond rappelling from a helicopter. They were looking for laser cutters and sleeping gas. They were prepared for a cinematic battle. They were not prepared for the reality of logistics. They were not prepared for the fact that when you are moving a 10-ton box through a foreign city, you are at the mercy of the men who drive the trucks and the men who operate the cranes. The KGB investigation concluded that the leak was a Level 1 security breach of unknown origin. They purged 3 mid-level scientists who had innocent contacts with Westerners. They demoted the guards who had served on the tour. They tightened the screws on the entire space program, creating an atmosphere of fear that stifled creativity and slowed down development. They had convinced themselves that the Americans were wizards. In reality, the Americans were just opportunistic lumberjacks. While Korolev was screaming at his subordinates in Moscow, asking them how the Americans walked through walls, he should have been asking a different question. He should have been asking, where was the truck driver? Because if he had pulled the employment record of the local trucking company in Mexico City, he might have noticed something odd. He might have noticed that for one night, and one night only, the regular roster of drivers had been shuffled. He might have noticed that the dispatcher had bought a brand new car the following week. But the Soviets were too arrogant to look at the help. To them, the drivers and the crane operators were invisible mere furniture in the grand palace of history. They couldn't conceive that the fate of the Cold War could turn on the whim of a blue-collar worker. This blindness was their fatal flaw. They built walls to keep out armies, but they left the back door open for the delivery man. And the Americans? They were waiting at the back door with a crowbar. While Colonel Korolev was tearing his hair out in Moscow, chasing phantom X-ray machines and invisible traitors, a group of men were sitting in a nondescript office in Washington, D.C., drinking bad coffee and laughing quietly. They weren't wizards. They weren't super soldiers. They were the men of the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence. And they had just pulled off the greatest magic trick of the Cold War without using a single gadget that couldn't be bought at a hardware store. The operation hadn't started with high-tech satellite imagery. It started with a simple observation. The Soviets were so proud of their Lunic probe that they were parading it around the world like a prize hog at a county fair. They were practically inviting the West to take a look. The CIA realized that the Soviet arrogance was their greatest vulnerability. The Soviets assumed that because the probe was surrounded by guards, it was safe. But guards are human. They get tired. They get hungry. They get bored. And most importantly, they follow orders. If you could control the orders, you could control the guards. The plan was hatched when the Lunic tour was announced for Mexico City. It was the perfect environment. Mexico City in the late 1950s was a chaotic, sprawling metropolis, a place where bureaucracy was flexible and where a few $100s could buy a lot of cooperation. The CIA team didn't bring lasers or sleeping gas. They brought toolkits, cameras, and a very good understanding of logistics. The key to the operation wasn't to fight the Soviets, it was to help them. The Soviets needed a truck to move the massive crate from the rail yard to the exhibition hall. The CIA made sure they provided the truck. Through a series of cutouts and local contacts, The agency ensured that the transport contract went to a trucking company that was, effectively, on the CIA payroll. This was the first layer of American dominance. Total environmental control. The Soviets thought they were operating in a neutral country. In reality, they were walking onto a stage set built by American intelligence. The night of the operation arrived. The Lunic crate, a massive wooden sarcophagus, was sitting at the rail depot. The Soviet guards were hovering, looking at their watches. The truck arrived right on schedule. The driver was a vetted asset. He was calm, professional, and completely under control. He loaded the crate. The Soviet escort car pulled up behind him. Everything looked normal. But then, the glitch happened. The driver didn't head straight for the exhibition hall. He took the scheduled route, but then, at a pre-arranged intersection, he signaled a turn. The Soviet escort car followed, assuming this was a necessary detour due to traffic or roadwork. It wasn't. The truck pulled into a large, walled lumberyard. The driver jumped out, looking apologetic. He explained to the confused Soviet escort through a translator, who was also an asset, that the exhibition hall was not ready to receive the crate until morning. The crane captain at the hall had gone home. There was no one to unload it. It was a lie, of course, but it was a boring, bureaucratic lie, the kind of lie that happens every day in logistics. The Soviet guards were annoyed, but they weren't suspicious. They were told the truck would be kept in this secure, walled compound overnight, and they could sleep in a nearby hotel while a local guard watched the gate. This was the gamble. Would the Soviets insist on sleeping in the truck cab, or would the promise of a warm bed and a hot meal be too tempting? The Soviets, believing their crate was sealed and safe in a locked yard, chose the hotel. They left. The moment the taillights of the Soviet car disappeared around the corner, the lumberyard came alive. This is where the American ingenuity truly shined. It wasn't about James Bond heroics. It was about carpentry. The CIA team emerged from the shadows. They had exactly one night. They had to open the crate, strip the probe, photograph it, reassemble it, and close the crate, all without leaving a scratch, a chip, or a broken seal. The crate was 20 feet long and made of heavy timber planks. The lid was nailed down. The Soviets had placed wax seals on the edges so that if anyone pried the lid up, the seals would crack. A brute force attack would have failed. If they used crowbars, they would leave marks on the wood. If they cut the seals, the Soviets would know in the morning. So, the Americans didn't attack the lid from the top. They attacked the crate from the inside out. They realized that the planks on the roof of the crate were nailed into crossbeams. If they could remove the planks without disturbing the sides where the seals were, they could drop into the box like cat burglars. But how do you pull a nailed plank up without leaving leverage marks on the wood? You don't. You verify the wood grain, you select the planks carefully, and you use specialized soft-jawed tools that grip the wood without biting into it. It was the work of master craftsmen, not soldiers. They gently, painstakingly worked the nails loose, inch by inch, sweating in the cool night air. One screech of a nail, one splinter of wood, and the game was over. Finally, the planks came free. The top of the crate was open. The agents lowered a ladder into the darkness. They climbed down. Inside, the Lunic probe loomed above them, a metallic beast sleeping in the dark. It was stripped of its outer cowling for transport, which saved them hours of work. But the engine nozzle, the prize, was still protected by a heavy guard plate. To get the data they needed, they had to remove the guard plate. But the bolts were sealed with factory tamper paint. If they turned the bolt, the paint would crack. The Soviets would see the hairline fracture and know the bolt had been moved. The CIA team didn't panic. They had anticipated this. They had brought a manufacturing specialist. They carefully noted the exact position of the paint lines. Then they unscrewed the bolts. The paint cracked. They removed the plate. Now the engine was exposed. For the next few hours, the lumberyard turned into a high-speed photo studio. The agents swarmed the engine. They measured the injector plates. They photographed the wiring looms. They took scrapings of the metal to analyze the alloy. They measured the thickness of the nozzle walls to calculate the heat resistance. They discovered something that shocked them. The Soviets weren't using advanced lightweight materials. They were using heavy, industrial-grade steel and enormous, clunky fasteners. The workmanship was rough. There were grind marks on the welds. It looked less like a spaceship and more like a tractor. But as the night wore on, the clock became the enemy. Dawn was approaching. The Soviet guards would be back at 7 a.m. sharp. They had to put it back together. This was the most dangerous part. Destruction is easy, creation is hard. Reassembly requires perfection. They bolted the guard plate back on. Now they had to fix the cracked paint on the bolts. The team had brought a kit of various paints and lacquers. The specialist mixed the colors by flashlight, matching the dull, oxidized gray of the Soviet factory paint. He applied it with a single hairbrush, bridging the cracks, blending the texture until the bolts looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Then they climbed out. They replaced the roof planks. They hammered the nails back into the original holes, using a cloth buffer to silence the strikes. They dusted the top of the crate to hide their footprints. By 6 a.m., the crate was sealed, the tools were packed, the cameras were hidden. When the Soviet guards arrived at 7 a.m., groggy from sleep and breakfast, they found the truck exactly where they left it. The local driver was leaning against the wheel, smoking a cigarette, looking bored. The night watchman nodded at them and opened the gate. The Soviets walked around the crate. They checked the wax seals on the sides. Intact. They checked the general appearance. Untouched. They signaled the driver, "Let's go." The truck roared to life and drove out of the lumberyard, heading for the exhibition hall. The Lunic went on display that afternoon. Thousands of people walked past it, marveling at the Soviet genius, never knowing that the night before, the Americans had been inside its belly. The data packages were flown to Washington immediately. The analysts at the CIA couldn't believe what they were seeing. They had expected a terrifying piece of futuristic technology. What they found instead changed the entire trajectory of the Cold War. The Soviet dominance was built on a lie. The mystery wasn't that the Lunic was too advanced to understand. The mystery was how the Soviets were managing to do so much with such primitive hardware. The Americans had solved the mystery of the Lunic, not by outthinking the Soviet scientists, but by outmaneuvering the Soviet bureaucracy. They had proven that in the Cold War, the most dangerous weapon wasn't a missile or a spy satellite. It was a truck driver who knew when to take a wrong turn. But the real shock was yet to come. The CIA had the photos, but they needed to understand why the Soviets had built the machine this way. And when they finally put the pieces together, the realization would shatter the myth of the missile gap forever. The photographs arrived in Washington, D.C., not as a triumphant pile of treasure, but as a stack of grainy black and white enigmas. They were developed in a secure darkroom at the National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, the air heavy with the smell of chemicals and high-stakes anxiety. The analysts who gathered around the light tables were expecting to see the future. They were expecting to see propulsion systems that defied American physics, alloys that were lighter and stronger than anything produced in Pittsburgh or Detroit. They were prepared to look at the face of a superior enemy. Instead, they found themselves looking at a steam engine in the age of nuclear power. The shock moment came slowly, then all at once. It began with the measurements. The CIA agents in the Mexico City lumberyard had done their jobs with surgical precision. They had measured the engine nozzles, the fuel lines, and the combustion chambers. When the analysts crunched the numbers, the results were baffling. The Lunic, and by extension, the R-7 Semyorka missile that launched it, was enormous. At first glance, size seems like a strength. A bigger rocket means a bigger warhead, right? That was the Soviet propaganda line. They built gigantic rockets because they were powerful. But the engineers at the table knew the truth. In rocketry, size is often a symptom of failure. If your guidance system is heavy and crude using vacuum tubes instead of transistors, your warhead is heavy. If your warhead is heavy, you need a massive amount of fuel to lift it. If you need a massive amount of fuel, you need giant tanks. If you have giant tanks, you need a cluster of huge, inefficient engines to get the whole monstrosity off the ground. The photos of the Lunic's wiring were the smoking gun. The agents had photographed thick, rubber-insulated cables bundled together with heavy clamps. It looked less like the interior of a precision spacecraft and more like the wiring harness of a 1950s dump truck. "This is agricultural," one analyst muttered, tracing the lines on the photo. "They aren't miniaturizing anything. They're just building it bigger to carry the weight of their own inefficiency." This was the first revelation. The Soviet lead in space was not based on superior technology. It was based on brute force. They were using 1,940 seconds technology scaled up to gargantuan proportions. But the second revelation was the one that changed the world. The analysts looked at the factory markings on the engine components. The agents had photographed the serial numbers stamped into the steel. In mass production, whether you are building Ford sedans or Kalashnikov rifles, serial numbers tell a story. If you capture a rifle with serial number 50,000, you know the enemy has a production line churning out weapons. The serial numbers on the Lunic components were low, shockingly low. They didn't suggest a factory running 24 hours a day, they suggested a workshop building prototypes by hand. This shattered the greatest myth of the Cold War, the missile gap. For years, the American public and the American government had been terrified by the idea that the Soviet Union was churning out intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, like sausages. Intelligence estimates fueled by Soviet bluffs and American paranoia predicted that the Soviets had hundreds of missiles pointed at New York and Washington. But the Lunic photos told a different story. You cannot mass-produce a rocket this complex, this heavy, and this crude without a massive industrial footprint. The markings suggested that the R-7 was not a weapon of war, it was a show pony. It was a handcrafted artifact, built specifically to scare the West, but practically useless as a strategic weapon. The R-7 took hours to fuel. It could not be kept on alert. It had to be launched from massive, visible pads that were easy targets for American bombers. And most importantly, there weren't hundreds of them. There were likely only a handful. The confrontation with this truth did not happen in a public speech or a declaration of war. It happened in the quiet confidence of the Oval Office. When President Eisenhower, and later President Kennedy, saw the intelligence derived from operations like the Lunic heist, and later confirmed by Corona satellite imagery, the dynamic of the Cold War flipped instantly. The fear evaporated. The Soviets, meanwhile, began to realize that their bluff was failing. This is where the narrative shifts to their desperation. They didn't know exactly that the CIA had taken apart their moon probe in a lumberyard, but they knew the Americans were suddenly unafraid. In diplomatic meetings, American negotiators stopped flinching. When Nikita Khrushchev threatened to bury the West, the Americans just nodded calmly. The leverage was gone. The Soviet leadership panic spiraled. They realized that their primary deterrent, the R-7, was a paper tiger. They knew that if war broke out, the Americans, with their Minuteman missiles and B-52 bombers, would wipe the Soviet Union off the map before the Soviets could even fuel up their monsters. The futile response from the Kremlin was a frantic, terrified scramble to regain the upper hand. They realized they needed a real weapon, not just a propaganda tool. They pushed their designers to build new missiles, better missiles, faster missiles. This desperation led to the Netherlands catastrophe in 1960. In their haste to test a new ICBM, the R-16, to replace the clumsy R-7, Soviet Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin ordered safety protocols bypassed. He sat in a chair on the launch pad, demanding the engineers fix a leak while the rocket was fully fueled. The second stage ignited while the first stage was still attached. The resulting explosion vaporized Nedelin and killed dozens of the Soviet Union's top rocket scientists. It was a disaster born of pure strategic panic, a panic caused by the realization that the Americans knew the truth. But the ultimate proof of the Lunic revelation came in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Historians often ask, why did Khrushchev take the insane risk of putting nuclear missiles in Cuba? The answer lies in the Lunic photos. Khrushchev put missiles in Cuba because he had no other choice. He knew the R-7 seconds in Russia were useless. He knew he had no reliable way to hit the United States from Soviet soil. The missile gap was real, but it was in America's favor. By placing medium-range missiles in Cuba, he was trying to create a cheap, quick shortcut to a strategic threat. He was trying to compensate for the fact that his mighty space rockets were actually fragile, heavy, handcrafted dinosaurs that the CIA had already dissected and dismissed. The shock of the Lunic operation wasn't that the Soviets were ahead, it was that they were miles behind. The Americans had looked under the hood of the Soviet war machine and found a hamster wheel. And the Soviets, realizing they had been exposed, spent the next decade trying to build a military that actually matched the one they claimed to have. But the damage was done. The psychological victory had been won in a Mexican lumberyard. The Soviets thought they were playing chess. They thought they were projecting strength through secrecy. But they forgot the most basic rule of the game. If you show your opponent your pieces, make sure they are real. And if you are going to leave your king undefended in a foreign country, make sure the truck driver isn't working for the other side. The impact of this single night of espionage was clearer than any photograph. It gave the United States the confidence to stand firm in Berlin. It gave Kennedy the steel to blockade Cuba. It allowed the US to invest in precision technology while the Soviets bankrupt themselves trying to catch up in tonnage. But there is one final piece to this puzzle, a statistic so devastating that it serves as the epitaph for the entire Soviet bluff. The verdict on the Lunic operation can be summarized in two numbers. In October 1962, during the terrifying peak of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. The American public believed they were facing a peer, a giant with a nuclear sword just as sharp and just as long as their own. But thanks to the intelligence gathered in operations like the Mexico City heist, President Kennedy knew the real score. The United States possessed over 170 operational intercontinental ballistic missiles, plus fleets of strategic bombers and Polaris submarines. The Soviet Union? They had 4. That is the killer statistic. 4 operational R-7 launch pads capable of reaching the continental United States. The thousands of missiles that the Soviets boasted about were a myth. The endless production lines were a fantasy. The Lunic probe was not the tip of an iceberg. It was a stage prop. This disparity explains why the Cold War ended the way it did. The Soviet Union was a master of the first. They achieved the first satellite, the first man in space, the first moon probe. These were spectacular, singular achievements designed to grab headlines. But a superpower is not built on headlines. It is built on consistency. It is built on the ability to do the hard, boring work of mass production, quality control, and economic stability. The Lunic investigation revealed the fatal flaw in the Soviet DNA. They could build one of anything, but they could not build many. They could handcraft a miracle, but they couldn't manufacture a standard. While American engineers were designing the Minuteman missile, a solid-fuel rocket that could be built by the thousands, stored in silos for years, and launched in seconds, the Soviets were still wrestling with the giant, clumsy, liquid-fueled monsters that required a team of artisans to assemble and a day to prepare for launch. The Lunic heist exposed the difference between a command economy and a free market of ideas. In the Soviet system, fear drove innovation. Scientists lied about capabilities to avoid the gulag. Factory managers cut corners to meet quotas. The result was a military machine that looked terrifying from a distance, but was rotting from the inside. The Americans, by contrast, leveraged a system where bad ideas were discarded and good ideas were scaled. They didn't need to fake their strength, because their strength was in the depth of their industry, not the height of their rhetoric. The legacy of that night in Mexico City echoes through history. It was the moment the West stopped flinching. It was the moment the United States realized that the Red Menace was not 10 feet tall. The Cold War dragged on for another 30 years, fueled by proxy wars and regional conflicts. But the strategic question, the question of who really held the technological crown, was answered in 1959. The Soviet Union eventually collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. It bankrupted itself trying to build a military it couldn't afford, to defend against an enemy it couldn't deceive. And it all comes back to a quiet lumberyard, a few blocks away from a bustling Mexican street. History is often written in blood and fire. We remember the wars, the speeches, and the explosions. But sometimes, the most pivotal moments happen in silence. The Soviet guards slept soundly in their hotel beds, dreaming of the glory of the motherland. The truck driver smoked his cigarette, watching the smoke curl into the night air. And a few men with wrenches and cameras quietly dismantled the myth of Soviet invincibility, one bolt at a time. They put it back together, they sealed the box, and they walked away. The Soviets never knew. The world never knew. Until now.